One of the best summations of the Satanic Panic is in Megan Goodwin's Abusing Religion. In it, she writes, "Here is an almost unbelievable but nevertheless true fact about U.S. religious history. In the 1980s and early 1990s, psychologists, law enforcement officials, nationally syndicated talk show hosts, and at least one sitting U.S. senator believed that Satanists were trying to corrupt our nation's youth through predatory child care centers, encrypted rock music, and tabletop gaming systems that could serve as literal gateways to hell." The troubling part about our current understanding of the Satanic Panic is that we tend to think of it as having ended right around 1995. Today we're going to look at the origins of the panic and how we're still panicking to this very day. On some level, we can trace the origins of the Satanic Panic back to the author Mike Warnke. In 1972, Warnke released a book called The Satan Seller. To call the book explosive and lurid is something of an understatement. In the book, Warnke claims to have become addicted to drugs in college and eventually turns to selling them. This brings him in contact with Satanism, whom he implies are responsible for a major portion of the drug trade in California. Seeing his potential, he then gets recruited into the Brotherhood, a Satanist organization that Warnke implies is a division of the Illuminati, as a satanic high priest. This allows him to start mutilating the cult members willy-nilly, commanding demons to defeat his enemies, and engaging in a seeming never-ending orgy of sexual pleasures. All good things must come to an end, though, and eventually Warnke is ousted by the Brotherhood. He turns his life around, despite demonic assaults from the same, marries the girl from high school that wouldn't give him the time of day, and becomes a good Christian. So how much of what Warnke claimed happened did? Well, an expose in Cornerstone magazine, an evangelical Christian publication by John Trott and Mike Hertenstein, found that Warnke did, in fact, live in California.
So I got that going for me, which is nice.
Other than that, it appears that Warnke was just a relatively straight-laced kid who had already begun to show a talent for acting and pathological lying by college. Unfortunately, at a time when conservative Christians in the U.S. are worried about drugs, pornography, anti-family trends, and new religious movements, Warnke's ideas really have an impact, not just at the bookseller, but at the voting box as well. W. Scott Poole writes of this period in American history in Satan in America, quote, "The Christian right used the hoary and powerful language of spiritual warfare to describe their efforts to reclaim American culture for Christian values. Ronald Reagan obligingly courted these same conservative Christians in the presidential elections of the 1980s, and then converted their concerns into legal movements such as the Meese Report on pornography and the War on Drugs. Reagan also echoed the contemporary concerns over communism felt by a lot of conservative Christians, reflecting them through a demonic lens when he stated to the National Association of Evangelicals on March 3rd, 1983, quote, "For Marxism-Leninism is actually the second oldest faith, first proclaimed in the Garden of Eden with the words of temptation, 'Ye shall be as gods.'" End quote. Now, I'd love to show you the actual bit in the speech where Reagan says this, but it appears that the Reagan Library isn't really a fan, as the so-called evil empire speech from which this emerges gets cut off well before this section, which is really strange because they're willing to keep this little gem in.
A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much on people's minds, and he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, "I love my little girls more than anything," and I said to myself, "Oh no, don't say that." But I had underestimated him. He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God."
Panic really starts to take off is after the publication of Michelle Remembers. Here we get into the psychiatric field's contribution to the Satanic Panic. Michelle Remembers is kind of like a mixed genre book, half psychological case study and half saints' life literature. In it, Dr. Lawrence Pazder relates his use of hypnotic regression therapy on the pseudonymous Michelle Smith. The problem with this form of therapy is that it stands a good chance of inserting memories as it does of dredging them up. And Michelle obligingly divulges all sorts of horrific experiences that she had suffered at the hands of the Satanist cult her mother supposedly belonged to, experiences which included her being physically dragged by the devil with his tail around her neck and prophesying about future events. It is a weird, grim, screwed up book. And after that, Pazder and Smith got married. America ate it up. It's probably because, either by intentional design or accidental memory soup, Smith's tale uses a lot of familiar tropes from popular media, like Warren Keith's The Satan Seller, on William Friedkin's The Exorcist, and Malachi Martin's Hostage to the Devil. It probably activates the Exorcist effect that Laycock and Harrelson discuss in the book of the same name. People start worrying that maybe there are Satanists in their backyards as well, or maybe in their daycares? This leads to a rash of accusations against childcare facilities like the Kern County case, the San Francisco Presidio case, and probably most notorious of all, the McMartin preschool case, in which hundreds of accusations of abuse are leveled by highly suggestible children against their care providers. And who met with parents and children in the case before it went to court? None other than Lawrence Pazder. Parents were even so afraid that a children's book rose up to meet the need of discussing the Satanic Panic with kids, a book that I have to assume caused far more harm than good. And before we consider these accusations to be politically neutral, let me point something out. If you were, say, conservative Christians who wanted to keep women in the home, taking care of their children, instead of having careers, that anti-family movement, what better approach is there than to demonize daycare? But then that's it, right? The US rights the ship. We all figured out we'd gone temporarily insane, but we're better off for it in the end, right? Well, let's hold our horses there for a second, because some of this stuff might seem a little close to home that we're talking about. After all, aren't conservative Christians still harping on the idea of satanic organizations, children being preyed upon, communism from the devil, etc., etc., etc.? Yes, and I would argue it's because we never stopped panicking. What do I mean when I say we never stopped panicking? I mean that the main idea from the Satanic Panic, that demonic cults are still sexually predating upon children in an organized manner, never stopped being believed by a significant subsection of Americans. So let's see how the Satanic Panic continues, even after it's supposed to have officially ended. There are a variety of different strands that we could follow, but I want to offer just two here. First, we're going to come to an old favorite of mine, Malachi Martin. Martin's most famous work might be Hostage to the Devil, but he definitely continued to write after that. Gradually, his writings move more and more towards arguing that the Vatican is not only in bed with communist countries, but is also tied to Satanism and the demonic. For instance, he writes in Windswept House, quote, "Suddenly became unarguable that now, during this papacy, the Roman Catholic organization carried a permanent presence of clerics who worshipped Satan and liked it, of bishops and priests who sodomized boys and each other, of nuns who performed the black rites of Wicca, and who lived in lesbian relationships within as well as outside of convent life." He also started to speak, specifically on Art Bell's show, Coast to Coast AM. Coast to Coast was kind of like an early conspiracy show, where everything from UFOs to recordings of hell to government conspiracies could be discussed with experts. Malachi Martin was one such expert, and the subject of at least 7 shows until his death in 1999. While these shows ranged far and wide in their topics, Martin often stuck to the focuses of his books: Vatican sex scandals, the idea of demonic influence upon and satanic groups inside the Vatican, and the ideas surrounding exorcism, or at least Malachi Martin's sort of weird brand of imagined exorcism. On these shows, fact and fiction collided, with Bell suggesting that Martin's more scandalous works, which were often billed as fiction, were only supposed to be fiction, but it's not. On these shows, Martin sets up a kind of far-ranging conspiracy in which the perfectly possessed individuals, that is, people who show no signs of demonic possession, have acquired vast wealth and political power by aligning their families generationally with the devil. These discussions later became a favorite of QAnon, a group that believes Democrats are part of satanic cabals that prey upon children, and one of the groups well represented at the January 6th insurrection. To recap, we never stopped panicking. Another interesting thread to follow is D. Corydon Hammond's work. Hammond was a psychiatrist who used hypnotic therapies, not unlike Lawrence Pastor. At the 4th Annual Eastern Regional Conference on Abuse and Multiple Personality in 1992, Hammond delivered a talk called Hypnosis in MPD, Ritual Abuse. Here, he raises the idea that there are highly placed former Satanist Nazi doctors who are deploying sleeper agents throughout the world in an attempt to create a playground for their own twisted pleasures. A large component of their conditioning is sexual abuse. In other words, satanic ritual abuse, but this kind with a kind of secular possession that undergirds it. Hammond's ideas are picked up in one of the most celebrated conspiracy theories in modern America, Kathy O'Brien and Mark Phillips' transformation of America. Phillips, who apparently attempted to deprogram O'Brien on his own, credits Corey Hammond with guiding the initial therapy, and writes that Hammond was, quote, the single most valuable live information asset I would know in my quest for expert therapy advice. This man is my personal hero. End quote. Transformation has to be read to be believed. It's a fantastical tale of Nazi scientists, ritual impregnation, Vatican and Jesuit conspiracies, and political malfeasance on a massive, massive scale. You might even be kind to look at the book and dismiss it out of hand, because no one would believe anything that crazy, right?
Greetings, Earthlings.
Oh, you see, my patience is growing.
I have a great guest today who's also a great friend for many years, and she is the author of 3 books that I want to mention. One is called, her first book is called Transformation of America. Kathy O'Brien. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Roseanne. I'm so happy to be here. This is a wonderful opportunity to bring truth to light. You and I have such great conversations, and it's delightful to get to share them this time on your podcast.
Isn't it great?
Yes, and I'm so happy to be here.
We were always going, what would be the message? What would be the big message we could give? Because we, between us, bring years of experience in breaking free of mind bindings, and in your case of MK Ultra mind control, as a victim of it under this government.
Okay, now perhaps you're thinking, sure, but that's November 2nd, 2023. Maybe Barr was just reading the writing on the wall and getting into all that QAnon type stuff. Well, maybe. But then we need to explain her appearance over a decade earlier, opening for both Phillips and O'Brien.
Big hand to Roseanne Barr.
I thank you all so much for coming. I think I won't be up here long. You're going to hear really important and interesting and life-affirming, life-changing things tonight, if you're paying attention at all. And I just wanted to say it's so cool that this church had us and has allowed us to come here because, I don't know, it's just so cool that truth is being spoken in a church. It's like at first, there's just so many paradoxes. There's just so many things. This is what mind control does to us. It seems to start at a church level too for most of us, but mind control, man, a lot of people left the church because, you know, they kind of got wise to a lot of the happenings inside the church, which have to do a lot with, you know, horrific child abuse, pedophilia, money laundering, and blah, blah, political action committees, all the horrible things. But
Activity tends to feed the energy of the criminals that are in control of our government right now, manipulating the minds of all of us. I was born into a multi-generational incest-based family like so many other people are. There's certainly nothing rare about it. That was what they wanted for mass mind control in a society. It's what they wanted for that kind of Manchurian candidate attitude and for being able to manipulate, ultimately, the politics of the planet as well as the population as a whole.
One of the most interesting things about this, of course, is that it happens in a church. Once more, we never stopped panicking. And it is this panic that continues to inform the United States into its third decade of the new millennium. And these conspiracies are insidious, not the least of which because they continue to be present again and again in entertainment. From True Detective to Longlegs, the Satanic Panic is reprised again and again for media consumers and presented as true. And if there's one thing that I like to remind my students in my religion and film class, it's that consumption is another word for eating. And as the old saying goes, you are what you eat.